The journey begins. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a weekend getaway for four friends eager to escape the monotony of city life. Jake drove, with Emma in the passenger seat. Mia and Chris lounged in the back, passing snacks and laughing at old jokes. The car was filled with music, their spirits high as they cruised along the winding highway through dense, remote woods. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the road seemed to stretch endlessly. The GPS lost signal, and the group found themselves relying on a paper map Chris had jokingly brought along. "Just keep going straight," Emma said, her finger tracing the faded lines on the map. "There's a motel about 20 miles ahead." The forest grew darker, the trees forming a suffocating canopy overhead. Jake switched on the high beams, illuminating the road ahead, which was eerily empty. No other cars, no sign of life, just an unbroken stretch of asphalt surrounded by shadows. Hours passed. The 20 miles felt like 100. The group's laughter faded, replaced by uneasy silence. "Shouldn't we have reached it by now?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "We have to be close," Jake replied, though doubt crept into his voice. Then they saw it. A wooden sign on the roadside, its paint peeling. "Welcome to Ravens Hollow. Population 1,431. The group exchanged confused looks. "That wasn't on the map," Chris said, flipping through the pages. Moments later, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Jake slammed on the brakes. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by matted black hair. She stood motionless, staring at the car. "Should we help her?" Emma whispered. Before anyone could decide, the woman turned and walked into the woods, vanishing into the darkness. The group decided to keep driving, shaken but eager to find the motel. Soon the trees thinned, revealing a small town. Dim streetlights flickered over old, crumbling buildings. A gas station sat on the corner, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Jake pulled in, and Chris got out to check for directions. The station appeared abandoned, the windows dusty and shelves empty. "Hello?" Chris called. His voice echoed. A faint rustling came from behind the counter. Slowly, a figure emerged. A gaunt man with hollow eyes. He smiled too widely. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. His voice was a rasp, barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Chris asked. But the man simply repeated, "You shouldn't be here." Panicked, the group left the gas station and drove deeper into the town. But no matter which turn they took, they found themselves back at the same spot. The gas station, the buzzing neon sign, the hollow-eyed man watching from the window. "It's like the road's looping," Jake said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Emma spotted something in the rearview mirror. "Guys, the woman's back." She stood on the road behind them, closer this time. Her face was pale, her eyes black voids. Jake floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the town. The GPS beeped back to life, but its screen displayed only one word: turn around. The forest swallowed them again, the town disappearing behind them. Relief turned to dread as the headlights illuminated the wooden sign once more. "Welcome to Ravens Hollow. Population 1,431. "No!" Jake yelled, slamming the brakes. The woman appeared ahead, this time with more figures standing beside her, shadowy humanoid shapes with glowing eyes. The car stalled. The shadows approached. No one dared to move. The last thing they heard was a soft whisper, carried on the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." The next morning, the car was found abandoned at the edge of the woods, its doors wide open. There was no sign of the four friends, just a new sign at the town's entrance. "Welcome to Ravens Hollow. Population 1,435. Late one stormy night, Sarah found herself lost on a winding road. The rain poured relentlessly, making it nearly impossible to see. Her car sputtered and died, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. In the distance, she spotted a dim light emanating from a large, decrepit house on a hill. Desperate for shelter, she trudged through the rain toward it. The house stood tall and foreboding, with its wooden shutters swinging in the wind and ivy climbing up its walls. The door creaked open as if inviting her in. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The foyer was cold and smelled of damp wood. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its banister covered in cobwebs. The house felt alive, the walls groaning and creaking as if whispering secrets. As Sarah explored, she noticed strange things. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her, their eyes following her every move. The clocks all showed different times, their hands spinning erratically. A mirror in the hallway reflected not just her image, but shadowy figures standing behind her, vanishing when she turned around. In the living room, she found an old diary. The entries were cryptic. They never leave. The house knows you're here. Run while you can. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut, and the locks clicked into place on their own. Panic surged through her as she tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were unyielding. It was as if the house was sealing her fate. The lights flickered and the air grew heavy. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a shadow slithering across the floor. She turned to see a figure, pale and translucent, standing at the base of the staircase. Its hollow eyes stared at her, and its mouth moved silently, as though screaming without sound. Sarah bolted up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried every door, but they were all locked except one. She burst into a small bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. A child's toy sat in the corner, rocking on its own. The whispers grew louder, unintelligible and maddening. The walls began to pulse, oozing a dark, tar-like substance. Sarah screamed as she tried to wipe it off her hands, but it only spread further. She noticed an old key hanging from a nail on the wall. Desperate, she grabbed it and ran back into the hallway, hoping it would unlock the front door. But the house was no longer the same. The staircase spiraled endlessly, doors led to brick walls, and the whispers turned into guttural growls. A voice boomed through the house, low and menacing. "You came here willingly. You don't leave unless I allow it." Terrified, Sarah stumbled upon a room filled with mirrors. In their reflections, she saw herself, aged and decayed, trapped in the house for eternity. Among the reflections, the shadowy figure appeared again, reaching out to her. Sarah's screams echoed through the house as the figure dragged her reflection into the glass. She felt her soul being pulled, her vision going black. When she awoke, she was in the same foyer, but now it was pristine, the walls freshly painted and sunlight streaming through the windows. Relief flooded her until she realized something chilling. Outside the windows, people were approaching the house, a young couple, drenched in rain, seeking shelter. Sarah tried to scream, to warn them, but no sound came out. She was now one of the shadows, eternally trapped, watching as the house claimed its next victims.
The small town of Blackwood was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Hidden in misty woods and surrounded by towering pines, it was a quiet retreat for those looking to escape the noise of the city. But beneath its calm surface, Blackwood had its secrets. Mara, a reclusive artist, had just moved into an old cabin on the outskirts of town. The locals warned her about the place. "Strange things happen in the woods," said Mrs. Hargrove, the elderly woman who ran the town's general store. Mara dismissed it as local superstition. She needed solitude for her work, and the cabin offered just that. The first few days were peaceful. The silence of the forest was almost soothing, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant owl. But one night, as Mara sketched by the dim light of her lantern, she noticed something strange. Her shadow, cast on the wall by the flickering flame, didn't quite match her movements. When she tilted her head, the shadow tilted just a fraction too late. When she stretched her arm, it hesitated before following suit. She laughed it off, blaming exhaustion, and went to bed. But the next night, the shadow grew bolder. As Mara worked on a painting, she caught it smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't belong to her. The sight sent a chill down her spine. She stood abruptly, spinning around to face the wall. The shadow froze, its grin fading into a neutral shape. By the third night, the shadow had begun to act independently. It would slink across the walls, exploring the room like a curious animal. It would pause to stare at her, its head cocked at an odd angle, as though it were studying her. Mara stopped drawing, her nerves frayed. She kept the lantern burning all night, afraid of what would happen if the room plunged into darkness. She tried to ignore the whispers in the back of her mind, the growing sense that the shadow wasn't hers at all, that it had never been hers. One evening, desperate for answers, she ventured into town to ask about the cabin. The locals were reluctant to speak, but finally, Mrs. Hargrove relented. "They say the shadow belongs to him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" Mara pressed. "The man who built that cabin. He was an artist too, obsessed with capturing the essence of life in his work. But he went mad. They found his body in the woods, but..." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "They never found his shadow." Mara returned to the cabin, her thoughts racing. That night, the shadow didn't just mimic her or move around the room, it spoke. "Stay with me," it whispered, its voice a raspy echo. "Let me show you what he couldn't." As the lantern flickered and the room grew darker, Mara realized the shadow was no longer confined to the wall. It began to creep toward her, spilling onto the floor like ink. She tried to flee, but her body felt rooted in place, her limbs heavy as lead. The last thing she saw was the shadow enveloping her, its grin stretching impossibly wide. When the townsfolk ventured to the cabin weeks later, it was empty. The lantern was still burning, and on the wall was a new shadow, a perfect silhouette of Mara forever smiling back.
Subscribe to my channel.